Hello, my name is Derek Robertson. On behalf of my group members Lauren Cash, Vanessa Mundruff, and Dina Togel, I will be discussing finance and outcomes of the consolidation era, 1976 through 1993. It's important to note or to consider what was happening at that time. In the decade prior to the consolidation era, higher education organizations had become accustomed to increases in revenue and expenditures. As an aside, please note that the aforementioned increases were not entirely or solely the result of rises in enrollment, which had nearly doubled at that time. As a matter of fact, allocations to government-funded research tripled, and state funding to higher education was up fourfold. As you can imagine, or you may infer from these facts, educators were on cloud nine. They enjoyed certain things such as annual budget increases for rising salaries. There was always funding for equipment and special projects, and capital improvement money. Yeah, totally available. For all intents and purposes, things were good, and higher ed staff persons were either forgetting or had no real sense of concepts like scarcity of resources or being poverty stricken in terms of their lifestyles. When the mid 1970s rolled around, many analysts working for different publications were cautioning higher ed administrators that the previous decade's trend of increases in revenue and expenditures was coming to an end. More specifically, they called attention to an impending or anticipated decline in public resources and in traditional age students going to college, i.e., the 18-year-old population. Nevertheless, higher ed organizations would not be easily moved. And why is that? Well, we all know that higher ed organizations always have been married to traditions, and they are not quick to reinvent themselves or change. The other part of it is negotiating reductions in expenditures would prove difficult because to many in the higher education organizations, the expenditures felt like entitlements. And finally, even in the face of a double-digit increase in inflation, higher ed organizations were still hoping to find ways to continue functioning and operating as normal. But that would be a lofty goal when the cost of everything from utilities to library books was rising. Now, let's take a look at funding changes or shifts in both the per student and per institution categories. As it relates to students, federal aid shifted away from grants and financial aid packages were more loan heavy. Tuition was on the rise, and students and their families would have to foot an increasing proportion of the total cost of instruction. On the opposite side, i.e., the institutional side, increases in state funding were not on par with increases in enrollment. Philanthropic funding moved from general awards to being designated or earmarked for specific purposes. Corporate funding came along with contracts for specific services, and the availability of discretionary dollars was on the decline. So now we can talk about or unpack the sources of revenue for higher ed organizations. From where was this money coming? An important thing to note is that colleges are always short of money. It's important to think about it because the context of of the work that we all do, or most of us at least, think about it. It's always better to spend the funding that you have available in your department or for the particular projects on which you're working so that you can go back and evidence a need for more. Surpluses in funding or leftovers lead to inevitable cuts in funding. So we're always, as higher ed organizations, best off when we can uh, show that we need more money. But we also need to be mindful that the allocations to specific projects or departments could be different from year to year. So colleges and universities will often keep that in mind as well. Among the sources of income are, as is listed on this particular wheel here, tuition and fees, endowment earnings, sales and services, private gifts and grants, as well as government funding from these federal, state, and local levels. Now, this table, which compares sources of income in 1975 through 1976 to that which was happening in 1992 through 1993. So what we're looking at is the beginning of the consolidation era versus when it was coming to an end. Federal, state, and local revenue were trending downward or decreasing, and tuition, along with money from endowments, private gifts, and grants, sales and services, and other sources were either the same or they were on the rise. So particularly, for example, if you look at tuition and fees here, you can see that the percentage of total revenue in 1975 through 1976 was 21%. Whereas in 1992 through 1993, that particular percentage of total revenue had increased by 6%. And we'll discuss this a little bit more in depth on the slide which follows. But looking here at other things such as federal government, state government, and local government, we can see that those were trending downward in terms of the percentage of total revenue that was allocated to higher education organizations. Now, this particular slide calls our attention to the comparison in 1976 to 1993 of tuition and how it grew increasingly prominent while revenue from government entities declined. Particularly for higher ed organizations, tuition and the percentage of revenue allocated from tuition was up by 6%, whereas government allocations were on the decline, with the decline in state government funding being the most hurtful. At the state level, tax limitation initiatives and increased demand for funds from other state agencies like prisons were among the reasons for the decline. There was lots of competition from state agencies. As you can see noted here, in 1980, higher education funding was at 9%, whereas that which was allocated to corrections facilities was at 2%. But a short 17 years later, in 1997, the funding for prisons had surpassed that which was given to or allocated for higher education organizations. So expenditures was a really important thing to think about, but also cost control. And so let's think about or talk about what was happening during the era with respect to those things. Inflation of the time has a correlation to institutional expenditures. During the consolidation era, institutional expenditures increased by 30%, with four-year institutions being impacted the most. Four-year institutions per student expenses went up by 34%, whereas the per student expenses at two-year schools was only up by 18%. Public and private sectors are also important to consider. So the public four-year school saw a 27% increase in per student expenses, whereas private schools saw a 40% rise in the per student expenses. I thought the table below was interesting. It shows a comparison of the higher education price index and the consumer price index. As you can see, the higher education price index steadily increased in the years leading up to the consolidation era. It then surpassed the consumer price index at the beginning of the consolidation era by 2%. And by the end of the consolidation era, the higher education price index was greater than the consumer price index by 17%. So, cost cutting, what were the challenges, difficulties, ideas, and methods used to address this particular question that was uh, for all higher ed organizations to consider? Some of the challenges and difficulties included thinking about faculty salaries and how to keep those competitive, the lack of universally agreed upon measures of productivity, prestige. The prestige of the institution often meant spiraling cost. Fixed salary schedules despite disparities in teaching loads and class sizes. So there was some consideration about when one professor teaches so much and has larger classes, how can you pay him or her the same as you pay someone who has a lesser load? Research monies brought in by different faculty members. Should there be some staggering of salaries based on that? And the expansion of course offerings was also a challenging and difficult thing to consider. But some of the efforts, ideas, and approaches used include better building utilization, i.e., energy costs, paying attention to those. Moving students into one building is something that universities and colleges will often do during the holiday season, especially with the international students. Voluntary early retirement programs were offered, increases in class size, library budget cuts, and finally, the idea to eliminate classes with low enrollment. So, among the outcomes of the consolidation era, I first and foremost want to share with you some of the goals. First and foremost, one of the goals was to have more diversity in the student body, inclusion of everyone who could be recruited under the color of thought that those without a college degree faced a bleak future, and increased dependency on tuition as a source of revenue for both public and private schools, and expanded involvement within the community to include having research tied to economic development and industrial ventures, community service ventures by professional schools, hospitals that were open to more broad segments of the population, legal aid, and some influence on governmental policy. What was the goal of the era in terms of other things? Let's continue with research funding increased fivefold. The number of high school grads who immediately went to college increased from 51% to 63%. Delayed entry numbers were up. Higher ed was absorbing people from all walks of life. The enrollment of students from every socioeconomic group increased, and the United States began to rank tops in the world for intake and graduation of young people. Amount of time for degree completion increased. Amount of education was more prevalently regarded as tied to earning potential, and assessments became increasingly more important to justify budgets and expenditures. This concludes my presentation on the consolidation era. Thank you so much for the opportunity to present, and I hope this has been helpful. Enjoy your day.